Okay, so we need to get started, but we can't start without making a very special mention of the arrival of Brad and Kelly. It's your first day. Yep. Granddaughter. Grandchild. Grandson. Oh, he's a boy. Yeah. Looks like a boy. Looks like a good boy. But he was only a little fella. He was only 10 pounds what? Wow. 10 pounds. Just a squirt. So congratulations, guys. And if you think to pray for Ryan and Bonnie, probably couldn't do that because the next 3 months, as most of us know, hell on it. Okay. I'm going to pray and we'll get started. Father, so tonight we're going to do something, well, ambitious, I guess, and almost impossible without you. Well, actually impossible without you. We're going to have a conversation about suffering and justice, and our nature is to get the black and white answers, but would you speak to us individually and corporately in such a way that we might step closer to head and heart knowledge of your heart, that we might not be so focused on having to have all the answers. Amen. Okay, so this, for those that are new, we've been doing this Bible class now for 3 years, I think, and I try as hard as I can when I am conscious of. I try to be honest. Is what I'm trying to say. I try to be really honest, and sometimes that can be maybe a little bit. What's the word? Unnerving. I don't think that's a word. Anyway, here's what I'm trying to say. This week, I have become more conscious than ever that while I know lots of things about God, I don't know God well. And the reason why I'm telling you this is not so that you all of a sudden will go, oh man, you've been doing a Bible class for this long and you don't know God. I need to leave. Maybe you do need to leave. That is a very real option if you feel like you're being taught or led by someone who doesn't have a good handle on, or have an intimate relationship with God. Maybe, you've got to do that. Maybe that's what I'm telling you, because I need you guys to have an opportunity to really know who it is that's teaching. I think at the moment I'm okay in my heart before God to be able to continue to teach. But I can't teach without being like 100% honest about where I'm at the moment with this. I don't know that I mentioned any of this to anyone last week. Maybe I did. I can't remember. But it sort of started about this time last week when I started to just unravel. And in the best possible way. I really feel like there is good things coming for God and I, and hopefully for all of us. So I don't know what you can do, what you're meant to do with that. Except that maybe there are others of us who have been able to survive on knowing things about God and have settled for knowing things about God because He just hasn't revealed the deeper, intimate aspect of the relationship yet. And I'm not happy to be there any longer. So I'm just going to pursue this journey. Pursue it. I'm going to let Him pursue me. I can't pursue it. There's nothing I can do for it. Obviously, I can't impress God so that He would be like, oh, let's strike up a deeper relationship. But I do want to believe that that's possible, and I do want to believe that He will pursue me on that level. And who knows? Maybe there'll be some deeper insights that come out of it. Long term. You would think so. You would hope so. So anyway, there you go. If you need to get up and leave, you can leave. No joking. We're going to try now and work through these poetry books. It's no surprise it's happening to me as we go through the poetry books, because as we talked about last week, there is an obvious intention on behalf of the Holy Spirit and the authors who authored these books to try and get at us on a heart level. What the wisdom literature does, and as a subcategory of the poetry literature, which is these 5 books, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs, or Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes. So this poetic wisdom that we've got here in Job is intentionally aiming at our heart. Now, there's one very obvious reason why it's not going to get to our mind like a lot of the prose literature does. I'm wondering maybe if anyone's got an idea why we're not going to be satisfied reading Job, just trying to understand it on a cognitive level.
There's a lot of unanswered questions. There's a lot of stuff that's not going to be answered.
Yeah. It's like it just throws up a whole heap of really real questions. There they go. Here's all the most real questions. And there's just no real answers that are going to satisfy our brain. But there is something about these, and I can speak from personal experience here, that will get to our heart. And I don't know, is Morgan here tonight? It's probably a good thing. So for those of you from Living Temple, you know Morgan Jilks. He had a little brother called Tyrone, and his little brother and I were very good friends because he was a freestyle motocross rider in a ministry that I was managing all the athletes in. And in 2013, Tyrone died attempting a world record jump. He was jumping the length of a football field, and as you can imagine, you're travelling through the air, 60 feet high, and you're going 100 metres long. When you come up short, you stop pretty rapidly. And so he basically died instantly. They revived him for a moment, but then they had to turn off the life support in hospital. And that came the year after I had witnessed one of the BMX riders in that team achieve a world record jumping his BMX bike, this time not a motorbike. And then he went out to celebrate. Now he was jumping his push bike. You can watch all this on YouTube, it's unbelievable. Like 75 feet, like 30 metres on a kid's 20-inch BMX bike. This full-grown man go flat the kid down a hill and, flying to the moon. And he crashed a couple of times attempting it. And there's one crash where he came falling out of the sky and went boom, straight into the back of the landing ramp. And he just crushed like an accordion, the cartoons. Sort of bounced back and rolled down the back of the hill. He got up back on his feet and walked to the top of the hill and tried it again. I remember seeing him, I was there. I was seeing him fall out of the sky thinking, how great. But 2 broken legs for sure. And I'd seen that multiple times, so I knew what I was looking at. And he didn't. Well, he went out to celebrate. He jumped off the balcony and slipped and killed himself. Yeah. The year before that, literally the year before that, one of our other BMX riders, his little brother this time, jumped on the back of a motorcycle, was getting doubled down the street, car pulled out, killed him. So 3 years in a row, at Easter time, we'd lost someone very close to us, or someone who was part of the team. And I remember racing down to Newcastle just before Easter 2013 to try and catch Tyrone in the hospital. We heard that he'd been revived and that he'd made it to hospital alive and had him on life support. And so we were on Tambury Mount at the time, raced down the coast, jumped on a plane, and obviously get on the plane, turn the phone off, you get off the plane, turn the phone on, and as we pulled in and turned the phone on, all these text messages coming through, Tyrone's died. And I was thinking, man, I have got so many questions. I cannot understand how this kind of thing happens. Now that might nurses and doctors get frustrated that people like me have those questions because they go, if you're going to jump motorcycles, this is going to happen. They get quite frustrated when you pull into emergency with a broken leg. Well, you did it to yourself. This is the kind of sympathy you get. And I understand on that cognitive level, yeah, like it's like, of course, you risk this kind of thing. But on a heart level, you're just like, you're so broken up because you've just lost someone that you love and you've been travelling with and living with, basically. Anyway, we had his funeral, and it was one of the worst days of my life. And Morgan, he got up and spoke. Morgan's Tyrone's older brother. I don't know how much truth there is in this. I've actually never done any looking into it. But you know how some people are really into the numbers in the Bible? There are certain numbers that represent certain things. And I totally get it. I absolutely believe it. I just don't know how far I take it. Anyway. Morgan and Tyrone, they used to race motorcycles before they jumped them to perform. And Tyrone's number was 777 and Morgan's number was 888. And if you ever catch Morgan with his shirt off, you'll see two whopping great big tattoos on his back. 777 and then 888. And Morgan got up at the funeral and he said, I prayed to God and I said, why would you take Tyrone? Like, he was the best kid, he was one of the good ones. Why would you take him sort of thing? And he said that God had said to him, well, Tyrone being 777 was like Jesus. He had to die so that his Holy Spirit could come and dwell amongst the people. And that 888 apparently represented the Holy Spirit. And Morgan at this point, and he will admit this, he was not living a overly committed life, and saw this as an opportunity to sort of pull his finger out. And, well, if you know Morgan, he's an incredible man of God these days, and something very special happened. Anyway, in his story, I don't even know if 888 means Holy Spirit. I've never looked into it. But when he told his story, there was something that hit me in the heart. There was some peace, I think, is what it was. There was some peace that hit me that meant that I still had all the questions, but they just didn't matter as much anymore. And there was something about having a peace of God that meant I just knew intuitively I'm probably always going to have these questions, but they're not going to plague me anymore. There is some comfort that has now come and that is resting here. That means that I can live with it. And I think as we read through, particularly Job, but all of the wisdom literature, we're going to find, well, let's pray, that while we're going to ask lots of questions, and we know that they're not all going to get answered, that we might come into a deeper understanding of who God is, that the questions become less significant, and just knowing God becomes enough. And that's my hope and my prayer for the class as we go through the next 5 weeks. And I think certainly Job is a really good way to kick it off. Now, for the cognitive, the author, we don't know who he is, but it could be confusing because he writes from a Israelite or Jewish perspective about a non-Israelite who seems to know the Israelite God. Now, this stuff is nowhere near as important as it was with the historical narrative for us. Getting that cultural and literary context sorted in our mind before we walk through those first 17 books of the Bible. With Job, this isn't going to frustrate us. Well, it shouldn't frustrate us nearly as much. But for those of us that are interested and didn't get a chance to read through the textbook this week, there is an early Jewish tradition which most conservative Christian scholars would hold to, is that this is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, written work of the Judeo-Christian religion. On the other end of that is an argument that it was actually a book written after the Judeans were exiled into Babylon. And for those of us that have done history, this will make much more sense. But remember, we read the entire history of Israel And how many mentions of the devil did we get?
One?
One. And what mention was that? The serpent.
Didn't even
So which book was that? Genesis chapter 3 it was. Okay. But is there anything in Genesis chapter 3 that says that snake was Satan? Is there anything in chapter 3 of Genesis that says that snake was anything other than a crafty creature? No.
Not explicitly.
Yeah, not explicitly. Sure. What is the implication? What's the implicit?
It's not implication, it's inferred.
Okay, how's it inferred?
Well, people look at a creature trying to tempt someone and think, well, that must be Satan. I don't think the text implies
Yeah,
that.
right.
I think that's
But
just
what do you
what
need to
it's
have
saying.
in your mind before you can think that?
Yeah, well, you need to know about Satan.
You need to know about Satan. Now, we're looking at this text now from the perspective of the first readers, and again, if you're new, one thing that we try to do whenever we read a book is try and get inside the mind of the original audience, because for any text, I believe, to make any kind of sense, one, and primarily, we need illumination from the Holy Spirit. Two, we need to understand what the original intent of the author was to the original audience. Because if what we are interpreting from Scripture is not true of the original audience, it's not true for us. If it wasn't the original intention and we've imposed something on it, well then it's just not what it was, what the text is saying. And so we're getting inside the mind of the original Israelite reading this thing, and there's been no mention of Satan. There's a peculiar crafty creature in Genesis 3. There's nothing necessarily to indicate that this Satan that turns up in the first chapter of Job is someone that they're meant to know. Yes, Nath?
So, for all we know then, the original Jewish readers, when the book was first written, they could be reading this and they may not necessarily connect the two characters. Maybe they'll think this is some other angelic figure who is, this is a bad pun to use under the circumstances, but playing devil's advocate in God's courtroom at the time.
Okay, so right now, man, we're never, just so you know, we're never going to get to the end of this.
Of course not.
The other thing is, in Genesis, it talks about God bruising the serpent's head. So, it's going to say that all animals who are deceptive are going to implicitly have their heads bruised by God. I don't know where that's meant.
Right. Okay. So what we're dealing with is a highly illustrative, poetic, what do you call it? Metaphorical narrative. And I'm careful when I say metaphor, I don't mean not true. I just mean the language used to communicate the truth is illustrative, and so it's filled with metaphor to try and put images in our mind. Written in an ancient language, in a book, Genesis, that we read as prose. We read through it like it's just a piece of history. And so, there's all this confusing stuff going on. We're not 100% sure. Certainly, the ancient Israelites, it would have been confusing. What's this idea that the seed of the woman would bruise the head of the serpent, but then the serpent would strike the heel? It's like, now we have, the Christian, the advantage of like the cross and seeing exactly what Jesus did.
2020 hindsight.
Yeah, that's right. We've got 2020 hindsight, so we can see perfectly, almost. But they don't. Now, just to throw a little bit more confusion on top of all of that, remember when we're reading the books chronologically in our English Bibles, these books appear in a different order in the ancient Jewish text, and when we get to the prophets, we're going to find out that the prophets actually were prophesying back up in the period, mostly in the period of the kings, which, when we read the likes of Isaiah and Ezekiel in particular, there is, well, depending on your school of thought, either direct or indirect mentions of Satan in their work. And so, look, I'm muddying the water, and that's a good thing, because the water is muddy at this point when it comes to an understanding of who Satan is. We'll get to that in slightly deeper terms in just a moment. The reason why I bring it up right now is to say that if it is a very early piece of literature, well then the Jews are conscious of Satan throughout almost their whole history. If it is written in the post-exilic period, which critical scholars are going to argue, that supports their idea that this ancient religion was void of a personification of evil, being Satan, until they returned from Babylon, where they would have been exposed to Zoroastrianism, which was an ancient religion that by that point in time had a fully developed Satan character. And so the Jews that returned from Babylon returned with a little bit of that influence and then wrote books like Job and but put a more fully developed evil character in the book to kind of help the Jews understand where evil is coming from. Something like that. Now, I think that's important to think about.
It's kind of cool, really, because you think about it, it means most of the Bible isn't as concerned with Satan as it is concerned with God.
Which, is such an important thing to go back to. When we did New Testament, we talked about this a lot, but a mistake to make is to adopt this idea that God and Satan are locked in an arm wrestle. Like Satan in some way is equal to, but just slightly lesser than God. It's like this spiritual sort of battle going on, and there is a spiritual battle going on. I'm not arguing that, but it is not like anything happens without God's permission. Because the dividing line that we need to draw up in our minds is not good versus bad, but creator versus creation. And there is only one creator, that is God. Everything else is a created being. And so that's the way that the serpent is depicted in Genesis 3. Just another one of God's creation. It's a crafty one, but it's just another one of God's creations. And so whatever Satan is in their mind at this point, he is certainly not someone who's locked in an arm wrestle with God. In fact, when we get into the first chapter of Job, we find that, depending on your translation, shouldn't say that, we find that, I think it's fair to say that we find that Satan appears as just another one of the sons of God. There is nothing in the text that makes him explicitly evil, worse than any of the other angels that meet in God's throne room. In fact, the Hebrew, the way it's written is that Satan is not actually this particular angel's name, and angel's not even the right word because he's not exactly.
It was a cherubim.
It was a cherubim, that's right. Oh man, we could go. Of the heavenly beings, there are angels and there are cherubims and there are seraphims, and they are different created beings. But let's just call them angels for the sake of simplicity right now. We don't have time to go into that. So it's not like there is an angel called Satan in Job. There is an angel who is the accuser. Satan just means adversary or accuser. And depending on who's teaching the book, they'll take slightly different tacks here, but everyone is confident with the fact that it's not like God goes, "Hey, Satan," as if that's his name. The angel presents as an accuser, and that fits the narrative, because what is the accuser doing in Job at this point when they get to the council meeting?
Accusing.
Yeah, he's just accusing people, and that doesn't necessarily mean that he was doing it in a malevolent way. Again, there's nothing. See, a problem that a lot of us have is, how can Satan come into the presence of God? How is that even possible? Isn't he being cast out of heaven? And well, maybe not at this point. Maybe at this point the accuser is literally fulfilling his role as an accusing cherubim, like a prosecutor would for the police. So that the police have got to go up against a private citizen, so they employ their own accuser. That doesn't make him benevolent. Unless he's corrupt, then he is. And unless he's corrupt, then he is. Okay, we'll do a little bit more on that in a moment. Let's just talk about the fact that this book here, whilst we can trust it is historically correct in that Job is referred to in the New Testament by the New Testament authors as a real man, and that the land of Uz does seem to find its geographical location in a portion of land that we know to be real, up in the Mesopotamian basin there by the Tigris and Euphrates. If you've got your maps in your folders, that'll be at the top. That'll be at the top of most of the maps. We can see that, okay, well, this is probably a real thing that happened, a real story that happened, but the way it is written, obviously, has been written with some fictional support. Now, we as Western readers get nervous about that because the moment we start talking fiction, we start talking fake or make-believe, and so I don't know who coined the term, but I know David Pawson, who's a widely respected Bible teacher, uses it. He would call this book faction, or this poem faction. It's a factual story that is written in a fictitious way. Now, whenever you write poetry to describe a factual event, you are using fiction. Because if we were to describe a factual event, there is no way that we would naturally describe it with like rhyming words and timing and cadence, like a limerick or something, unless you're a genius. But it would require genius because it requires thought. It requires going beyond what naturally is coming out of your memory, but actually comes out of your memory and then goes into that word processor to try and find rhyming words and enough syllables in those words to match the top. You know what I mean? And so because what we've got outside of the prologue and the epilogue of Job being the vast majority of the text, just the complaints and accusations made by Job and his friends, all written in poetry, means that someone has obviously sat down and thought, okay, how can I write this in such a way that this will be remembered as poetry? And again, we translate it out of Hebrew. In English, we don't get the rhyming because, well, one, they're not big on rhyming anyway. They have what's known as assonance and consonants, which is where in the Hebrew words you'll have words in succession that have the same vowel sound or the same consonant sound, but it doesn't mean that they end with the same sound in the way that we rhyme words. But we'll miss all that because it's translated out. What's exciting is that, and we talked about this last week, is that there is not just rhyme of word, but there is rhyme of thought. And we talked about the different ways that the poem's put together and structured so that we can know as English readers that the thought has been put in like rhythmically. Now, I'll be honest with you, I read it all again this week and it's really hard to see it. Really, really hard to see it. But it's there. Beyond that, though, is the fact that when we have the four disasters at the start of the book, we notice that each disaster meant that absolutely everyone and everything was decimated and destroyed except for one person who escaped. And then the next story, absolutely everything was decimated and then one more, and then one escaped. And it's like, okay, that's wild coincidence. If there are four stories in immediate succession of Job losing absolutely everything except for one person who could come to report it to him, I think it is just a fictitious way of telling this fact that, look, absolutely everything got destroyed. Then we also see that what was lost to Job, in the end, was, exactly double? Yeah, exactly double. And so, again, it's kind of like, all right, maybe God did bless Job at the end of the story, and we'll discuss the reasons for why that happened, because they aren't necessarily self-evident. But the fact that the author wrote it in as an exact doubling, again, look, I think that's probably more just a bit of poetic license. And we shouldn't be nervous by that. Because we have talked about how the ancient literature is not so focused on the exact in the same way that we are. And there is no question amongst the reader there that there's some kind of deceit going on. If they were really focused on the fact, and then we read things like this, we'd go, well, maybe it is a bit deceitful. But the original authors are in no way, shape or form trying to deceive anyone if they are writing some kind of fiction to communicate the truth. Now, all of that said, if you fall in the camp of, no, this is 100% historical, and despite the fact that the majority of it is written in poem, all the details are 100% true. Great. That's awesome. But for some of us who struggle with that, I don't think that you should do away with the book thinking that, oh, well, it's all fake because there's some fictitious stuff going on in there. Job is just some metaphorical character that never really took place in history. It was just a story written for us to gain some moderated truth. You don't have to do that if you think that this kind of thing here evidences some fictitious writing. Did anyone even battle with any of that this week, or maybe? No, good. Time well spent. Not. All right. Look, pull me up if we're doing things here that you guys aren't concerned about. Is anyone not clear of the original setting? There's like a meeting up in heaven. We're all on top of that. You can say no. Okay. All right. Well, that means we can move past this. And then we could even go past the quick outline and get straight into the text. Actually, you know what we should do? Let's have 5 minutes just on your table to have a conversation about the things that you're most interested in or concerned about, so that we can work out where it is that we're going to spend our time tonight, because obviously there's no way we're going to get through it all. So have a chat at your table, have a discussion about things you like, things you didn't like, things you've got questions about, and then I'll go to each table and we'll pick the major topic that you guys want to see discussed. Take it away.
I'm concerned about the issue.
I didn't read it.
It's a what?
But it could be based on the way it's set.
What do you think, Leah Marcos? It's very
I could get part of it. So when his friends come, mates come, they go, we've done something. And they just won't accept it and continually Exactly. He doesn't like it, but he's not going to curse God out for it and blame God for it.
That's how we think. Also, you made one my
Oh, really?
The more advanced, the more affluent the more
What is it?
Okay, 30 seconds and we'll wrap up conversation. Okay, we might start with the 6 p.m. guys. Do you guys have a spokesperson yet? I heard Dom, she was quite outspoken.
I've done it wrong again. Put the V in.
Okay, listening up, ladies and gentlemen. Dom is going to help us out. Go for it, Dom.
Well, am I just bringing the thoughts to the table?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, Tom and I think that it's like
Okay, so it's an ancient play.
Yeah, that's kind of like a teaching play, like to teach about God.
Okay,
Um,
purely fiction and
maybe not
necessarily, no.
necessarily. Like perhaps there was it's based on a story, but I think the way that it's written, which kind of just goes with the.
okay. Is there anything in our theology that hinges on this being a historical event?
What it said in the New Testament about Job,
Okay,
what James says,
what does James say?
talk about the patience of Job.
Okay, so could he be referring to an ancient play? And remember that what's a Shakespearean play that doesn't have historical fact? Most of it is he does historical stuff. doesn't he?
and Juliet.
Romeo. Okay, remember the love of Romeo and Juliet. Could that suffice?
But what about in Ezekiel when he mentions Job alongside, I think it was Daniel and Moses or someone? He mentioned three of them together.
That's interesting.
It might just be like me saying like, oh, Andy Storton, like guys like Andy Storton, so strong. Andy Storton, Tarzan,
Keep going.
Hercules. Just hard for everyone to follow that. It didn't make sense, but you know what I mean.
Thanks for that. I always feel really good for about 3 seconds. Okay, look, just things to think. I don't know. I'll be honest with you. I don't know, but I like it.
It could still be a play based on a historical figure. It could still be a real dude and just overdo.
Like Shakespeare did that too.
Mm-hmm.
And it would just kind of give a bit of context to the whole, like the names aren't Israelite, like just the whole kind of setting of it is just a bit bizarre. And
Yep.
there's a couple of things it's like, oh, that's a bit, I know, kind of answers a few questions.
And why they all speak in order.
Well, absolutely. Unless you're writing a play with rehearsed lines. Yeah. Okay. All right. Is there any other major insights to come from this group?
Just that it's really long.
Yeah, it's long.
I asked the question as to whether it is meant to take place over like a day or even just a few weeks. There's no, like they're going back and forth, but doesn't really. It's hard to understand. Yeah, it's hard to understand how long it actually went for.
Okay, so we've got it. That's right. I totally sympathise. You can read a book of the Bible 10 times before you realise a little detail that might help with something like that. And so certainly there's an indication that when the guys first turned up to hang out with Job in his walla or in his hopeless state, they remained with him for a few days before they said anything. So yeah, this is happening over a period of time for sure. Yeah. Okay, Timothy.
It also says that the last guy, like the last wise guy, was like hung out and listened to them all speak that whole time.
Yep.
I don't know how things worked back then, but I wouldn't hang out for too long, so I just.
Okay, that's what. So does anyone get any ideas as to? Does anyone get any ideas as to why the last guy? So there's 3 friends who took turns speaking, and they all had 3 goes at it each. We might even have a slide there to help us with that. Okay. So we've got Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and then right at the end, what was his name? Elihu, something like that. So he piped up. Does anyone know any idea, with all the historical understanding we have of the ancient Near East, what might inform us as to why he kept his mouth shut?
He was the youngest.
Okay, so he was the youngest. Who cares? In our culture, the youngest usually pipes up first, starts mouthing off. Okay, all right. So now this gives us a little bit of historical accuracy in that if it was written back then, it would make perfect sense that the youngest would sit down, shut up, and wait for his turn. And these guys had exhausted their turns, and then he pipes up with what seems, again, to be quite an authentic representation of a young person who likes to get up and say, listen, you're actually all wrong. Let me tell you how it is. I was sharing a little while ago, just like as the older I'm getting, the greyer everything gets. Like I love black and white, and it's like now it's like, wow, there's so much grey. I just only ever saw it as black and white.
Preacher's brother.
Yeah. Look, it's humbling, but it's humiliating too, because you think of all the things that you've said publicly. Well, maybe not you guys, but me. Oh, flipping it. We were talking this week at church. Dave Quake was sharing about how a few years ago somebody went through all my online sermons, pulled out a whole heap of stuff, mostly out of context, sent it up to the Baptist Union to try and get them to kick me out of the Baptist Union. What they didn't know was, first, I'm not a Baptist, I'm not a part of the union, they can't do that. But when I did talk to the Baptist Union, because they knew of me, I studied at their college, they were like, who is this person? Like, they really hate you. Like, oh, yeah, they do. If someone was to go back, and if I was to go back on all of my stuff, I promise you there would be whole sermons I would say, please delete that. 100%, I'm just not there anymore. In fact, that's may have noticed, but I've slowed down on the preaching a lot in the last 12 months because I'm just so nervous to say things I know.
That could be said of any preacher, though.
100%.
If it wasn't, then they're not learning, they're not growing.
Yes, and that's a great challenge, isn't it, Jacqueline? Ask yourself, when was the last time you shifted on your theology? Because that was probably the last time there was any growth. That's a big call.
No, I agree with that.
Okay, look at all the wisdom we're getting from Job. Actually, we're getting it from Jacqueline. But anyway. All right. Okay, so good, very good. We're going to move along. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Dom, and 6 p.m. crew. Okay, what have we got down here?
I didn't like Job. I thought he was a whinger and he's so self-righteous. He said tickets all over himself. I'm going to shut up. And he's going on and on. But what I didn't realise when Sarah just said to me after I said that, he was probably still working off like he wasn't a Jewish thing. But if he knew of God, he probably thought of the kind of, well, if you do good, you'll be right. And he's going, well, the whole time I've been doing this. Because he's just listening to all the stuff he's done, and I'm going, yeah. But he was only trying to do kind of what he thought God wanted. And then he's so surprised, he's like, how come? God, you said this, and now look at me, I'm crap. And the whole time I'm a good guy.
We forget that God doesn't have like the tall poppy syndrome Australian thing going on. Where
Yeah.
like, oh, you think you're good.
Okay.
But the one thing I got out of it, I just read this thing here, it said, and he's mentioned this twice, he said, if only there was a mediator between us, someone who could bring us together, a mediator could make God stop beating me, and I would no longer live in terror of his punishment. And then I could speak to him without fear, but I cannot do that in my own strength, and I just immediately thought of Jesus. And so he's kind of like so frustrated because he doesn't have that connection we have.
Yep.
And when we get that connection, we just know we can go straight to God.
Okay, so yes, 1,000 yes. When was the last time the Old Testament spoke of, like, this crafty character? Right. And there was a peculiar mention of someone or something that was going to enter the story at some point to deal with this character. We were just talking about it a moment ago.
Yeah, the media.
Someone's going to come defeat this guy. The next time we hear about this peculiar adversary, and then we get another picture of maybe someone's going to come and... Now, look, he doesn't say maybe. He says, oh, I need something here. This is the genius of the ancient... This is when anyone ever comes at you with the argument that the Old Testament in particular, but the Bible in general is just this primitive work of antiquity. You can blow them out of the water. 66 books written across 1,000 years, 3 continents, with over 40 authors, and somehow there are these perfectly interwoven stories that all lead to the cross. And you can't tell me that the guy writing Job was, well, maybe you could tell me this. But the guy writing Job, he was thinking of, maybe he was under inspiration of Genesis 3. Maybe he was. But despite the fact, right, that's an awesome pickup. And so there's allusions to a Messiah here, and we're talking about a play. And Dom, when we talk about a play, is this still written under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit?
Yeah.
Okay. Job is spoken. He speaks of himself as a righteous man.
God did too.
God speaks of him as a righteous man, and who else does?
Pretty much
The
everyone.
accuser
Yes.
speaks of him as a righteous man. So where we get pictures in the Old Testament of righteous men, Joseph, Daniel, Job now, what is this foreshadowing? Christ. Yeah, there he is in the Old Testament again. Now, we've got to be careful that we don't take the allegory all the way and say that for Job to be a type of Christ or a foreshadow of Christ, that Christ must fulfill every behaviour of Job. No, that's not the way foreshadows work. There are elements of the story that sort of cast a vision of a righteous man who suffers, and somehow through his suffering, we then are brought into this greater understanding of, and the ultimate picture of this what Christ did for us, obviously. Okay, awesome. Now, last thing I want to do with Glenn is that, yes, he said he was righteous. He was up himself. Yeah, that's it. I'm getting more and more convinced that the ultimate sign of humility is being able to tell the truth when it makes you look arrogant. I'll say it again. The ultimate picture of humility is telling the truth even when it makes you look arrogant. So you're willing to herald the truth and have everybody left thinking, oh, he's stuck up. The false humility that comes, I think, in our culture would be like, look, I don't want to come across like I'm, the font of all knowledge, and maybe I'm wrong here. And when you know you're not wrong, and you know you're telling the truth, and you only do it so that people don't think you're arrogant because you're too concerned about what people think about you. Now, how you apply that is up to you. I'm not going to tell you that you need to go out sprouting the truth to, pagan sinners or something, and who cares if they hate you, that's not what I'm saying, but apply it however you like. But maybe he was just arrogant. Maybe he was. Mate, he's certainly, well, if he's not, he's suffering mentally, isn't he? Because sometimes it's like, praise God, and sometimes it's like, God, what is wrong with you? There's something wrong with you, not me.
It's an emotional roller coaster.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of commentators will say something like, absolutely, yeah, that's perfectly put.
I think if someone humanly suffered all the loss of their children, the loss of their livelihood, then you've got boils all over your skin, you're reduced to nothing.
Yeah.
You're stripped away.
Yeah.
You're going to cry out to
Okay. All right, actually, that picks up on one more thing that Glenn made mention of. Or who was it? No, Sarah. You mentioned it, was it? To Glenn. The idea of their paradigm that they were thinking through.
I'm righteous, I was doing this and God worked, so I was way back there, like, follow me, you're blessed, don't follow me, you're cursed. Like, there was quite a system in that almost.
Oh, man.
And so to have the heartbreak of, where's this God? I know you're just for what's happening and not have anything. And the hard times that keep going.
Okay, so two things. Let's roll with your first one and keep working on it. The first idea being knowing, loving God, and then all of a sudden God's not like that anymore. Yes. But is there a development of his understanding of God?
Yes, and my next thing was a part that I loved about it was he's going through all this and he's confused in the ups and the downs, and his friends are coming in and saying, no, you follow God, you're blessed, don't follow me, curse, so it's you. And they keep kind of saying, there must be something. And then that seems like it's not all the New Testament, that at the end, God pipes up and says, no, you're wrong. And it just shows, like, opens up a whole new level of God, I think, and how if we don't understand him, there's levels of love and complexity that is completely white what we can learn in that.
Oh,
All in
high five. Okay, So there are whole new levels of complexity and love and all the other adjectives you used. What was necessary for that to be revealed about God?
Their worldview had to be shattered.
Yes, and how did that come about? to go through it.
It's like the refiner's fire. It's like when you're going through the fire.
Yep. Yep. It could also, yes, absolutely. It's the refiner's fire. And also, I think, certainly in this case, you thought that I was refining silver. No, I'm refining gold. It's actually, there's something fundamentally different about this product, about God, that you didn't understand. And what kind of a good and loving God would allow people to think he is one thing, to think he is silver, when he's actually gold? So an amazing story of a person I know who spent their whole life wondering why God would not reveal his love to them, could not work it out. God then turned up, but he was a completely different God. And I'm convinced that had he revealed his love, allowed this person to experience his love and intimacy with that person's mindset thinking that God was silver, she would have started to build a relationship with the wrong God. Like, it's a gracious thing for God to let the God of your head die so that he can be revealed in his truth.
Wow.
And I think, this is part of my unraveling right now. This is so, I don't know, maybe, this is dangerous. Pray about this, people.
Yeah.
I think what God is revealing to me is, Andy, you've held on to a wrong picture of God. Not complete, so not the wrong element altogether. But part of the reason why your heart hasn't received certain connection with God is because you're worshipping a wrong picture of God. And he's trying to reveal himself in his fullness and truth.
Well, that's what the Pharisees, that's where they mucked up.
Okay, so, all right, here, people, Christians, we're brothers and sisters. Okay, all right. Rant time. It's going to be a quick one. When Jesus came before the Pharisees, who did they think God was? Who did the Pharisees think God was?
Someone like them.
613 laws that have been put in a nice, neat package. This is who God is, people. And Jesus says to his followers, listen, do you be sure, do everything those Pharisees say, but don't you dare do anything they do. They had a picture of God there was elements of it that were true, but they were behaving like this God was a tick box, a tick and flick. They were behaving like they were God. That's what they were doing. And this is this is why preachers got to just be careful. And we're all preachers. When I say preachers, there's pulpit preachers, and then there's 32 other Greek words that get translated into proclaiming the gospel or preaching in the New Testament, and that comes in all manners. Sitting on a bus, and there were no buses, but walking down the street, having a meal. We're all preachers, okay? He says, you Pharisees are making disciples twice the devil you are. You've got this picture of God, not God, and you're converting people into following that picture of God. They're lost. There is no, they were innocent because they followed. No, they're doubly lost. Because they don't even understand the truth and they're just blindly following you. And so we need to be presenting Jesus, like really Jesus. We gotta just trust, because there's nothing we can do to fabricate it. Hey, we just got to trust that when we speak on Christ's behalf, we do so, as James says, as if we're speaking, it was 2 Peter, wasn't it? Speaking God's words. That's so, I don't know. Meditate on that for a little bit, hey? Okay, where are we up to? Well done, your table. Don't have a name for you. Okay, next table.
Sort of a similar thing. back and forth with Job. 1 minute saying God is, completely right, and then next minute, what have you done to me? And distrusting, and I was a little bit confused because it's really the first time I've read it through properly, Job, and I always thought that Job was just utterly always worshipping God, and then when he started talking against him, I was like, what's going on here? And then I sort of realised anyone that it totally relates to us because we go through periods where we're trusting. When everything's going well, it's great. It's easy to trust God, but when things are going bad, I mean, he lost everything. It boils, he was sick, everything that the human condition can experience in one man. It sort of represents everything man can go through. And of course he's going to doubt. He's human. We always doubt. We're always going to doubt and flip back and forth. Always for the rest of our lives. We're never going to be completely, at that point.
So Nicole, if that's true, if you struggle, because nobody else here does. All right. So we all laugh because we all know that's rubbish. But on Sunday, who's struggling? Or at Bible study, who's struggling? Maybe you're a bit more honest at Bible study. Okay, how about this? If you're leading the study, who's struggling? Okay, we're all ministers of the gospel. How many of us are willing to go, you know what? I don't even know. Last week you were on cloud 9, you were praising God because he paid your bills and extra money in the bank, you booked a holiday to Hawaii. Now, I think that's pretty authentic Christianity right there. Well, I don't know. Because what we do on a Sunday morning is kind of not, we don't see it in the New Testament anywhere to get an example, but I'm just wondering what it would be like. This is one of the reasons why I love Quack. It's like, you know if you're struggling, because he'll just tell you. And it affords the congregation the opportunity to be able to go, oh yeah, I'm really struggling. I don't know. And I think we could step it up a notch. I think what we learn in the end there is that Job's friends all only ever say good things about God. And God says, you're wrong. It's like you've got a friend and they're down the dumps and it's like you just come in with all the positive stuff about God and you feed them all the good things and the Job 29:11. It's not Job, what do they call it? Joshua 29:11. Jeremiah 29:11.
I think that was the beauty of it. When it comes into the end, it's like Sarah was saying that, God speaks, and it's actually quite comforting because I know, for me, the stuff I've been through, and it's like, well, there's a bigger picture here. It's just, there's no answers, but you don't need to know why. And I sort of thought, that's kind of cool. Actually, I just have to trust and sort of take each day by day, and that's really comforting. After all that back and forth, to read that at the end, God just goes, no, stop.
So, what is it, Christ? Christ is the author and perfecter of our faith? Okay. So, trust relies, another good English translation for the word faith. So, Christ allowing suffering, or God allowing suffering, and us being able to get to the point, or that forcing us to the point of, I don't need to know the answers, I just need to know God. And putting our trust in them. That's God working out faith, literally, putting faith in you. Because we can't muster the faith. We're human beings, we can't do that. Just so good. Go, Nicole, give yourself a high five. Okay, you done? I just jumped in. Sorry. You good? That's it?
I find, although they're saying, and especially when you watch that Bible Project thing, whatever it is, and they're saying, the guys, his friends are wrong in what they're saying. In a sense, by them saying Job is wrong, they are right, because he is wrong in his thinking.
Yep.
Which you find out later. So that's one part. And then two, the complexity that you see at the end that God trying to explain just excites me because it's like I'm probably never ever gonna know the whole truth and the whole part of it, but it excites me because it's just like every single little piece, everything you take in and read of the Bible and being like something like this and that is just expanding.
Yeah.
And if you allow God
Yeah.
to speak to us and do that and change you and you have that humbleness to go, okay, I'm not going to box you into what I think you are, and I'm going to go, okay, show me who you are. Like, that could expand, but there's no end to it, you know.
Okay, so now you're reading conscious of, and now we've got to practice doing this, because there's two narratives going on, right? So Job sits in the narrative of, I know nothing but suffering, but we got let in at the prologue with another narrative, which was happening up in the heavens. Yeah, like does God not know what's going on here? So now Job is confused. Well, you know, and have you ever asked where are you? I ask it almost every day. We need to discipline our mind that there is another story going on. It's not another entirely, but it kind of is, right? If we can remember that there is another story going on, there is nothing happening right now that isn't specifically allowed by God. And so like you say, Zoe, it's like how in the world are we going to get our head around the mind of God? Not going to happen. How much more is there possible for us if we just let go of trying to get everything sorted out in our own mind? Because there's the fundamental problem with the paradigm they're thinking in the first place. We haven't even really talked much about this. I think Sarah was the first to bring it up, though, with Glyn, maybe. Deuteronomy 28. Remember, blessings and curses. If you do the good thing, what happens to you? Good. If you do the bad thing, what happens to you? Curses. Now, that's good theology. That's covenant theology. Now, maybe this was written before the covenant. We don't know when it was written exactly, but if it was written after, okay, these non-Israelite people know a thing or two about God. But not everything about God. They've got the wrong God because they have flipped this equation. And they're saying, if something bad is happening, you've done bad. That's not what Deuteronomy says. Deuteronomy says, if you do something bad, there'll be bad consequences. But it doesn't say, just because you're suffering, that immediately means that you've done something wrong. And so again, this paradigm of, it's called retribution. Yeah, retribution. This idea that you do good, you get good, you do bad, you get bad. Morphed into, and it was present, it was thinking present in the New Testament. Can anyone tell me a story of a particular person? Big voice, Nathan.
Who sinned this man or his parents that he was born blind?
Upside down! He's blind! Something bad's happened. He must have done something bad, or his parents must have done something bad. That's exactly what Job's mate said. Oh, well, if it wasn't you who did something bad, your kids must have done something bad because they're all gone. Wrong thinking. Totally wrong thinking. They're trying to work it out, Zoe. Hey, and if they just, like Job did, allow God to speak, he realised, this stuff here, that's the world you live in, mate. And I'm not going to tell you why. But that's the world you live in. And so the only way for you to cope in that world is to do what Nicole said. Let's just trust God. Anything else from you guys? Good? Okay. What have we got over here, folks?
Like, is there any historical data that those three guys were actually real? I got the feeling that they're fictitious. This was just inner turmoil, in a conflict within his own mind, and he's processing the whole thing, backwards and forwards.
Sure. Have you got voices in your head?
It's just the same as Nicole said. We go backwards and forwards. Is God real? Is God good? Is God, and then where is God? And then he's there, and then he's not there.
Flip, that's actually pretty good. Has anyone had this experience? In yourself, you're up and down, you keep running back to what you know, like, I don't know, John, your favourite preacher, your favourite evangelist or whatever. It's like, I'm up and down, I'm just going to run back to that guy. Maybe Job he's going up and down and up and down, but he keeps running back to what he knows is, true of God. Except it's just something that's been told to him. So that's me, flipping it. Well, I've never heard anyone, I've never read that. But that's pretty good. Sure, I'm not going to believe anyone.
I got extra miles, mate.
Yeah, where's the chocolate?
Well, someone has pilfered all the chocolates from this table here, so I'd say it probably was these guys. Okay, anything else? That's so good, Chook. Yeah. Next time I preach some jokes or something.
Can you recap that for us? Because we kind of got it, but we missed the beginning, so we didn't fully understand the whole.
Okay.
Sorry.
Chook, you're going to earn chocolates tonight.
Really good. We just want to make sure we've 100% got it.
Sorry, I didn't catch that. My wife was in the
Can you just recap what you said again for us?
I wonder whether those three friends were actually real, or they just put names to them. And that was just the thought process that he was going through in his own mind. The inner conflict, the inner turmoil that was going, because he'd lost everything. And he's saying, why am I lost things? Why has this happened to me? Then he went back to say, well, God is good, God is looking after me, God is real. So it was a backwards and forward thought process, basically.
Except at the very end, didn't Job have to pray for those three friends? God asked Job.
Well, yeah, maybe he did. I can't remember that.
He might have been possessed.
He might have been. I'm not laughing at that. It's like, maybe. I think that kind of fits Dom potentially. Let's say Job is also fictitious, but there's an author who's writing a poem, or a play, sorry. And he's like, okay, well, here are the characters that, here's my John Piper, Francis Chan, and John MacArthur over here, and then the young guy, Dave Quack. Okay, not so young. And then, but here's the internal struggle going on, and just the people he keeps going back to. Like, I can't work it out. I've got to go get some advice. That doesn't sound right. If that's true, it resonates with me. I don't know about you guys. If it does resonate with you, then what would be the takeaway?
God revealed himself in the end.
Sorry?
God revealed himself in the end. It's true character.
Okay, so what would we need to do? Else not do?
Go back to what we know.
Right. Yep, and allow
God to
some
tell
fresh
us.
revelation. Okay, Chuck, you're running class next week, mate.
Okay.
I'll send you through my notes.
Okay. Next Monday's the good old.
What else have we got? Is anyone like pinging off in their spirit at the moment, like, we're going way, or no? Good.
Kind of keen to see what else we have.
I want to say something.
Yes.
So in Genesis is written.
Yes.
And then there's nothing written in the Bible between Genesis and Job. Is Job the first book after Genesis?
Well, in the order of the Bible, it's Exodus. Is that what you mean?
In the actual
Chronologically, a conservative scholar would say, yeah, it would find itself being written at some point during the period of chapter 12 of Genesis. So that's the age of the patriarchs.
Yeah. So we don't know really what the culture. We don't know much about the culture, about how people were living, about any religion, whether any religion was started after Genesis, like before the Abrahamic religion. So we don't. So there's a whole period there where basically it's that old and all the stuff has been lost. So we don't know. There could have been after Adam and Eve when you had the line of shame, the righteous one and the unrighteous one. We don't know whether the righteous line did have some sort of religion that was sort of tied to Abraham and his relationship with God or whatever. So there could have been all sorts of different things, cultures, and people, even the way that the people like worship God, and like these characters, Job, and you don't know the setup, whether at that time there was some sort of peace. That's how they did run their lives. They did believe in the blessings and blessings and curses. Maybe that was like a cultural thing at that time in that place, and these people were like the most righteous, and they did have some sort of spirit or wisdom that came from God. That there's so many things that we don't know about pre-Job and anything.
Well, I agree with you as far as the biblical text goes. We don't have any insight. Certainly, there's no contesting the fact that there was all manner of religions that archaeology has revealed to us. Like, in certain terms, that the Hittite religion was up and running well and truly by this stage. A lot of the stuff that comes in Leviticus is parallels Hittite commands. Eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. That comes directly from the Hittites and that, the dating on that is sort of maybe 300 years before Moses gets going. We've got Melchizedek is another high priest who worships Yahweh. That's our God, and he and Abraham, they catch up. So there's certainly, I agree. There is all the cultures around would have had religious. They did have religious institutions and laws and. In fact, a lot of what we read in Genesis is written as a refutation against the pagan understanding of how gods functioned. The Egyptian gods, they were up and running well and truly by that stage. I don't know if Pharaoh was considered God at that point, but certainly there's nothing to suggest that these guys didn't have an understanding of Yahweh. It was just a wrong understanding. Because you would have noticed as you read it, it's like, that's good advice. I believe that. They were big on, Joe, you're never going to understand God. They said that so many times. How many times have you said that in the church? It's just that they didn't understand that Job was being honest and humble before God. When he was down, he was down. He was telling God. When he was up, he was up. He was telling God. So, if it was written after all was said and done during the intertestamental period, same. This was just Persian and Babylonian gods, I guess, that they had ruminating around them, I guess. Yeah?
Yeah, that's what I was. Also, there could have been a person. I personally think that Job. That's sort of basically the truth of that.
A historically true event. Yeah. I'm right there with you. Yes.
There's a line from Genesis through to Abraham. It was passed on. There was a religion that was passed on from that he possibly could have.
Yeah, I think the intention of the author though is to say that Job isn't in that line because they're using all non-Hebrew names. And so that would, an author would, if he wanted to communicate that he was a part of the line, would certainly have, and all the guys that run the genealogies would have made certain that they put Job's name in the genealogy to tie him in, had he been a part of the Abrahamic line up to Adam. Because that's the one that follows, right? From Noah, whatever the good son was after Noah, they got down to Abraham. Yeah. Yes.
Would it be possible, just in the last couple of minutes we have left, to check out some of the other things we have written? Because we normally miss out on a ton of that on these nights.
That means that we miss out here.
Oh, sorry, I forgot there was a table left.
Okay. All right. Did you guys want to have a quick chat about the hell conundrum that we have and Satan? Anyone sort of touched on it at the start? No one knows that there's a conundrum. Put your hand up if this was something that was confusing this week, this whole idea of Satan and God. No one. All right.
I like the idea of it. I'm more interested in
Oh, you could talk about Behemoth and Leviathan.
Yeah.
That was like an extra exercise if we had time. It was just silly to even put it up there. Here, I'll ask the question. We'll give it 30 seconds. What was the Behemoth and the Leviathan?
I watched the Bible Project.
Okay, and what does he say?
They're just ancient beasts.
Like real beasts or mythological?
Mythological.
Okay. And we don't have a problem with that. If they're mythological beasts. We know that a lot of this ancient writing, especially in Genesis, and even the way God behaved in Exodus was a direct refutation of what the other religions thought about. You know, so these authors were communicating in a language that the original readers would have understood. And if I was to say, my God is big enough to take out the biggest dragon in the world, no one here would think I was lying, even though I'm talking about a mythological creature, a dragon. Right? And so in the same way, if you refer to Behemoth and Leviathan as mythological creatures and a God is way bigger than them, we shouldn't be concerned that, oh, they're not real, they have to be real. Now, maybe they are real, but if they are real, what do people often think they are? Okay, all right. Didn't know that we were going to go there. Because a lot of translations won't do that. They'll do something like hippopotamus or crocodile. And we were just going to do a read through it and draw them. Yes, Sarah?
No.
Oh, I thought someone said, can I just say something?
No, everyone was excited about dinosaurs.
What? Okay, why do they think they were dinosaurs? Why do we think they might have been dinosaurs?
Because their size.
Okay, so the way they're described. So when the behemoth, I think, which is the hippopotamus, or the elephant maybe, okay, let me draw the hindquarters of both an elephant, that is actually pretty good, and a hippopotamus. How is the tail described?
Like a cedar tree.
Like a cedar tree.
That word I've read can also be translated as trunk. the word for tail can be translated as trunk as well.
As trunk.
Yeah.
To make it, okay, well that doesn't fit for the hippopotamus.
Well, fits for an elephant.
Yeah, it fits for an elephant. Okay. I've never seen a translation that's ever put trunk in there.
I've read that before, I don't know if it's true.
Okay. Well, that's a hippopotamus and that's an elephant tail. If it is tail, that's a cedar tree, which looks a lot more like a, I don't know, dinosaur tail or something. The Leviathan, we like to think it's a crocodile because, yeah, it's definitely the Loch Ness. But again, when it gets described, it's not like, doesn't look, in my mind anyway, anything like a crocodile. It could be, for the young earthers, it could be a good argument that dinosaurs were living or cohabitating with human beings a very, very, very long time ago. I'm leaning more toward their mythological creatures myself, because that fits the way these guys have been writing at this period of time anyway. That's what I was going to do. It's kind of pointless. It was just for giggles.
And can we do something really quickly?
Yep.
Just quick. How old is the Earth?
How old is the Earth? Oh, I know exactly.
Just your
If you weren't here for Genesis 1 to 11, I'm not going back into it again. But YouTube Genesis 1 to 11, deeper class, and you'll have the conversation there.
Just a real quick 1 minute recap,
Maybe it's 14.5 billion years old. Earth, 4.5 billion years old. Maybe it's 6,000 years old.
And your answer to the question is?
The Bible doesn't tell us one way or the other. It tells us that God is a good God who creates things good, and that the reason why things are currently bad is because we stuffed it up. It doesn't talk about the age of the earth. That's my personal opinion. Others totally disagree and have built entire ministry empires on the idea that it does. So I'm probably wrong. Wrong there as well. Can't believe you guys don't want to talk about this. Sheol, Gehenna, anyway.
I mean, it's interesting, but I thought about it.
Sorry? Okay, so now when Sarah says hell, what do you think?
Fire.
Okay, fire and brimstone. Anyone else have anything else? What do you think? Okay, you be quiet for a moment. You're stealing my thunder.
Oh, sorry.
I'm going to call you up in a second.
It's a place totally separated from God. To me, I don't know where it is or whether it's a concept, but it just means no total separation from God.
Okay. All right, good. So we have a general consensus that hell is kind of the pop meaning of hell being like a place where we go for eternal torment, something like that. Maybe completely separated from God, maybe burning, maybe it's psychological torture, who knows? But it's something really, really bad. Correct? Yes, all right. So the Old Testament doesn't really talk about that place. The Old Testament talks about a place called Sheol. Let's go there. And it has 65 mentions in the Old Testament, and they're all over the Old Testament. But what we've got to understand is that as God progressively reveals himself to humanity the way he did through Abraham and his descendants, also theological concepts like what happens when we die, they develop over time as well. So this again is one of the reasons why we need to read our whole Bible. Because if you go to a reference of Sheol, in the infancy of Israel, you're going to understand Sheol to just simply be the place where everyone goes after they die. Just like the holding place for dead people. It's neither good nor bad. And then as the theology develops through different prophets, we understand that Sheol sort of becomes a place where maybe there is some torment and torture there, but then there'd be a chasm sort of between Sheol and for the people who've done wicked things, and then there'd be a place in Sheol for the good people, maybe, something like that. And that's an idea that has obviously really permeated the Jewish people by the time Jesus turns up, because you remember the parable he teaches about...
When they're separated, but they can see each other, but they can't.
Yes.
That's the gap between them, but
Yep.
they can...
I mean, that makes it sound like they're all in the same place, just with a wall across.
Yes.
That's right. This one's really hot.
So Sheol, the Hebrew word Sheol, is translated as Hades. Oh, I think it's Hades. Hades in the New Testament. And so when Hades is referred to, the English usually just translates it as hell. Sometimes it's Hades, but hell. And that picture of hell, the Hades picture of hell, is the holding place for everyone, where everyone goes after they die, and there is some kind of chasm between the two. Now, when Jesus refers to Gehenna, also referred to as hell, so this is why it's confusing, he's drawing on an Israel and Jewish understanding that there is a physical location at the south of Jerusalem in a valley called the Valley of Hinnom, where in generations gone past, the idolatrous Israelites would offer up their children for child sacrifice in this valley. And we learned about that, how that was an influence from the Canaanite religion, and that's one of the reasons why God wanted all the Canaanites out. Because he didn't want his people doing that. They eventually did. Now, once the Israelites were finally kicked out of Jerusalem, the Jews out of Jerusalem into Babylon, when they returned, we learned that there was one sin that the Jews never engaged in ever again. Idolatry. And as a part of idolatry was the child sacrifice stuff. And so, because they were so repulsed by what their ancestors had done, they turned the Valley of Hinnom into the garbage tip for Jerusalem. And so they just throw all the town refuse in there, and then they set a light to it, and big city, constantly throwing fuel on the fire. So it just became a place of eternal rot and decay and stench and fire. And so Jesus uses that picture to refer to hell. People don't like this. But it seems to be that there is no reference to Gehenna in the New Testament that isn't Jesus speaking about a physical location called hell, called Gehenna, called hell, that the wicked will experience in punishment. So now the illustration is the dump down back. But the application is a place of eternal torment. I don't like that idea. I don't like it. It just seems to me that's the way Jesus refers to it. So you've got to take it up with him. And then finally we have this Tartus that Peter uses briefly, which is of minimal significance. Now, the reason why this is fascinating is because in our Old Testament, that idea of hell hasn't been developed yet. It's just a bit confusing. We're not too sure. In fact, Job, he at one point refers to Sheol, going, I'll die and I'll never see God because I'm going to Sheol. And then he says, but maybe when I'm in Sheol, no, he actually says, when I'm in Sheol, I will be able to chat to him face to face. And so that reveals that there is a bit of confusion at this point as to whether or not Sheol is a place void, in the Old Testament, void of God's presence, or whether or not God's presence can actually penetrate Sheol and people will get to see him there. Now, look, that's like 101. That's less than 101. That's 99 level Sheol, Hades, Gehenna conversation. I'd encourage you to go and do some more reading on it. It is not true that our current modern concept of hell being that place of fire and brimstone, that is a consistent picture of hell that has been held through the Judeo-Christian worldview forever. It's not. It's something that has developed over time. And we've got to get used to the fact that when we read in the New Testament the word hell, it could be one of three words. Tartarus, Sheol, or Hades. I don't know why the translators don't make it a little bit clearer for us, but that's what we've got. Man wiser than I. I've got a couple of website links here. If anyone's really interested, email me and I'll send you those links. Okay, we've already gone 3 minutes over. If you need to leave, go. If anyone's got anything pressing, like they do want to get to more of this stuff, I can stick around for another, however long it takes, but I don't want anyone staying here under obligation because the deal is you get to go home at 8:30. So, anyone going? Yeah, well, I'm going to keep going for 10 minutes. If you want to jump up and leave, no judgment from me. Anyway, everyone else will probably judge you. Okay, let's quickly do the Satan bit. So, Satan as a noun, that's a. Oh, this guy's got to do uni work and he's got a speech tomorrow. Pray for him.
No, I'm getting a glass of water.
Oh,
see if anyone would react.
So, don't you have
We'll
work?
go in a minute as well. I got time.
Oh, the youth pastor's leaving. Okay, so Satan, again, in the Old Testament, this is not a noun. This is not like there is a character called Satan. We learn of an angelic being who is an accuser, who comes before God and accuses people. So that's, in fact, accuser or adversary is the English translation from Satan out of the Hebrew. Where we use the word devil, that's a Greek, well, it's an English rendering of a Greek word called diabolos. And even Paul refers to people as diabolos, as devils, as people who are just false accusers. So that's the definition of the term. They are, what are they? Descriptive. I guess they're adjectives. But they've become nouns because we learn through history that, and especially Revelation, that this accuser is potentially the angel, the serpent from way back in chapter 3, an actual created being. And so it's not just like some random accuser floating around, but hang on, there's someone who set them, something that set itself up to be against creation, even though it was a created being. The other term that we've got is Lucifer. Now this is a Latin term. I don't know how to say it in the Latin. I don't know Latin. But believe it or not, it means Venus. It's like, you know, the planet Venus. Okay, so here we go. The last star in the sky after the sun rises, like the last star to hold on to its light, to be visible, is Venus. So it's a planet, it's not even a star. So as the sun comes up, the brightest, like the most rebellious star, the one that refuses to be flooded out, is Venus. And in Isaiah 14, Isaiah is talking about a Babylonian king, a bad guy, but he talks about this Babylonian king in terms of, like, he's not just a bad person. There's something intrinsic about him, something behind him. There's some kind of dominion that he is under that is also evil. And so Isaiah refers to him there as, I wonder if I've got it, morning star. Now, the morning star, the only star that is still visible in the sky in the morning, is Venus. So, 300 years after Christ, we've got the Hebrew and Greek texts of the Old and New Testament being translated into the most common language, which is Latin. So remember, the Roman Empire is taken over, and so Latin's taking over slowly over the Greek. And so when Jerome was translating morning star, he knew that the Latin word for the morning star, that being Venus, was Lucifer, or the Luciferos, or whatever it is in the Latin. So this is like a word. This is just a name that's just sort of come 300 years after Christ was kicking about. It's a reference back to Isaiah 14, and so it's not. There's no. It's not like Satan was floating around up in heaven and was like, "Hey, Lucifer," you know. He was the morning star. So, and I mean, even that is just imagery, right? We've got to be just conscious of the fact that when we give Satan names, the Bible refers to him with descriptions, but not with a name. It's like it's almost like he's not really even credited with a name, kind of. Okay, so Satan in Revelation 12 is referred to as the great dragon, and it is at this point, the very last book of the Bible, that enlightens us that serpent right at the front in Genesis 3 is the same dragon in Revelation 12. The demon, the Satan, the Lucifer.
Did the Jews around Jesus' time believe that the snake was Satan?
I can't say unequivocally, but I would presume they would be confused at best as to what it was.
Well, they actually accused Jesus of having a demon.
Yeah, that's right. Because there is reference to. Okay, so further descriptions. You've got king of this age. You've got prince of this world. They're all more descriptions that had we just got the Greek word and transliterated the Greek word, we would have what we would call names for him. But they're actually just translations.
They also would have had a lot of text that had been removed, that's now been removed from the Bible, that, like, say, Enoch, that it does talk about hell and Satan, and it goes into a lot more depth, but we haven't got that to look at.
Okay.
Whether it's you know, but there'll be a lot. There's a camp that says, that should be in there. It's taken out. It's been taken out to
that's a good
get
point.
rid of Satan, and for us not to believe him as much as less real, because there's a lot that talks about him and hell and explains hell and how it's structured.
So only one qualification. Totally correct. Cam is correct. The intertestamental period between when the last book of the Old Testament was written and the 400 years where nothing really gets written or added to the Bible before Matthew kicks off with, Jesus. There is still lots of religious writing taking place from the Jews, and we get the Apocrypha there, where there's like 12 Deuterocanonical books, they call it, secondary to the canon. They were never totally accepted as books of the Bible, though some traditions, Catholic tradition in particular, will say no, they were a part of the Bible. And they have much more to say about devils and dragons and that kind of thing. And again, I think one of the accusations is it looks too much like Zoroastrianism, which borrows too much from Zoroastrianism for the scribes and the sages of the day to go, well, we think this is inspired. It's more influenced by other religions. So they would have had concepts, certainly, yes. That's absolutely right. The reason why I was confused is because the religious elite in first century Palestine, which is Canaan and the Promised Land and Israel and all those other terms, same place, they were divided as to what they thought about the afterlife. So you've got the Sadducees, you've got the Pharisees, you've got the Essenes, and you've got the Zealots and other groups. But these were sort of the leading groups of religious thought. Kind of maybe an equivalent might be something like Protestants and Catholics and Greek Orthodox, or something, the three big divisions or something like that. And you've got the Sadducees who don't believe in an afterlife. So I don't know what they would have thought of the devil. If they did think of him, it would have been someone that could accuse you in this life, but probably couldn't do much to you after that. The way to remember it is they didn't believe in the afterlife, and that's why they were sad, you see. The Pharisees, on the other hand, people would argue Jesus was probably a Pharisee, just a good one, just one that had it worked out. And so they had a much fuller understanding of the afterlife, because they didn't just accept the first 5 books of the Bible, which is what the Sadducees held on to, but they also held on to the historical books, the writings, and the poetry. And that's what we do as Christians. We believe in all of that. certainly Jesus did, because he quoted from all of it bar maybe 2 books, I think. I'll get that stat. I think Jesus quoted every Old Testament book except for maybe 2. So, I hope that answers your question a little bit. All right. A former angel. You've heard the idea that Satan was a former angel and then he fell. Okay, this idea again, I am not good at this. You're going to have to do your own study, but just to give you a bit of an indication of where that's drawn from, there is no one story anywhere in Scripture that says Satan one day walked up to God and said, I want your job. And God said, get out, you can take all your mates with you. And Satan turned around and said, well, who's with me? And then they all fell. We don't get that anywhere. And so if you've ever subscribed to that belief, you have done by just listening to somebody else. Here's the work you need to do. Ezekiel 28, 12 to 18, and you need to read all of Ezekiel, not just this reference. But this reference will again talk about a king. This time it's a king of Tyre. That's a town right up the north of Israel. And he was a bad dude. And in the same way that the Isaiah passage talked about a king who was more than just a bad king, but there was something, today we would say something demonic about him, that he was possessed or something. That's the same kind of thing that the king of Tyre gets. And so he is at that point described in terms that suggest that he fell out of heaven, or he came down out of heaven, or was cast out of heaven. And so because people read into this king as, well, he was more than just a king, there's something spiritually satanic about him, that angel must have come. And so we get pictures like that from both of these passages, but then Jesus himself in Luke 10:18, he says, I saw him fall like a star out of heaven. And remember, the morning star reference comes from Isaiah here. So we develop this idea, well, we've got a picture of the accuser in heavenly courts with God in Job. And we know he's a created being because Revelation tells us that the devil is the same as the snake in Genesis, who is one of God's creatures, his crafty created creatures. And if we want to go and do word studies in the Hebrew, the descriptions that are offered to that snake are all positive. They're not negative. The craftiness is not like deceptive. The craftiness is like he's really smart, wise. It's the same word that the Proverbs will use about wisdom. Fascinatingly enough. Or at least the same root, as far as I know. I don't know Hebrew. This is what I've been told, okay? So you've got to do it yourself. You can't just trust Andy because I read it somewhere. But Jesus here gives us probably the clearest indication that Satan did fall from heaven, so from some angelic state where he wasn't necessarily created to be the accuser or the deceiver, but he chose that path. But it's all developed from ancient prophecy. Okay, so I hope that undoes your very neat picture of Satan for a little while. And then I hope you do some work to go and discover whether or not there is something more to be learned about this creature. And I hope while we are conscious that he prowls around like a roaring lion, we don't give him the credence that suggests that he's shaping up, going to the weigh-ins against God as if he's like an equal opponent.
He's already defeated.
Yeah, well that's right. Yeah, we know that he's already defeated. So, yes. There you go. All right. Let's go right to the end. Okay. The 3 major questions that are getting addressed in the book are, is God just? Because they're all working out of this paradigm. Remember, the do good, get good, do bad, get bad. That's justice. We know that's justice. It is justice. And then does God run his universe according to the rules of justice? So if God is just, then it naturally follows that the world he has created should follow those laws. So that's what we get. We get this wrestle and tussle with this idea that, well, if something bad has happened, it is naturally, it's obvious that something bad happened before it. You did something bad before it. Now, we know that's upside down theology. They didn't. Question 3 then is, if the universe is running according to the rules of justice, how is Job's suffering to be explained when he says, but I did nothing wrong? And God says he did nothing wrong. And Satan says, well, he's done nothing wrong up until this point. And this is the age-old question, hey, God is all-loving and all-powerful. Well, how can an all-loving and all-powerful God allow suffering? He is either all-powerful but not all-loving, or he is all-loving but not all-powerful. For an all-powerful God could prevent suffering, but he's unloving, so he chooses not to.
But that suffering can bring glory to him.
Well, this is something that we're learning. Yes, this is something that we're learning, but with that paradigm of thinking, that doesn't make any sense. But we've also got to be careful, and when we do our apologetics class, we talk about this. When people are struggling with suffering, or any questions of God, there's two ways to answer. There's the cold answer, which is not necessarily wrong, but then there's the heartfelt answer. And when someone's suffering, the logic that Christians employ to explain why suffering is necessary doesn't make people feel better. When people are suffering, they're feeling something. They're not thinking something. And so we can learn from Job that to go and explain something away logically is not going to help, potentially going to make things worse. But actually, the initial behaviour of the wise men is probably more suitable. What was the first thing that wise people did?
Sit down.
Sat down. God doesn't come and explain it. What makes us think that we can sit down and explain it? When you're suffering, what is the first thing a kid does when he falls over and hurts his knee? Mum! Now, what is mum going to do? It should be, doctor, Benadine, I don't know, like stitches. Nobody thinks that. I'm 37, I fall over, hurt myself, and it comes out of my mouth. Mum. I was like, it's just, now there is a reason for it. I chatted to a physio recently. Hey, James, Dr. James Furness was telling us about it the other day. There's studies now going into the whole idea of like healing and dealing with pain. And just, he's saying like, get a hug. Sprain your ankle, get a hug. You'll be amazed at what that does. Your brain, it does things in your brain, And that's what we're naturally built to. We just want mum with us. And you go to hospital as a kid, you just want mum with you. When I go to the toilet, I just want Beck with me. I just can't just talk to me. Maybe I'm sharing too much. Shower. I'm like, can you just talk to me? She's like, no, it's disgusting. Go and wash yourself. No, just open the door and just we just want to be with people, right? Okay, this is the heart cry of any brother or sister in Christ. I truly believe we can be hurting and we can be suffering, but if we know God is with us, we can do it. But imagine no pain and no suffering and no God. Maybe I can't say this. I think I would say bring back the pain, bring back the suffering. I just want God. And I think the wisdom literature for us is going, good questions, legitimate questions, answers aren't going to help. The way to live the good life, the Bible Project talks in its thematic videos, not its how to read videos, but its thematic videos. The way to live the good life is to recognize all of that. They're good, valuable questions, but if you pursue an answer, you're going to be left wanting. There is a way to do this life despite the suffering, and it's just as Nicole said. It's with God. That's probably a good place to wrap up because you guys have given me an extra 15 and I appreciate it. I want to pray for you though, so I need another 30 seconds. You can make me roll if you need to. Because we have totally missed the boat if we get to the end of this 5 weeks and we've gathered up some good answers. There needs to be just like a heart shift, and it should be something that we're not really able to explain very well. I think if it's a real heart shift, it'll just be, look, I don't know why I can deal with the world better, I just can. And it's got something to do with more God. Lord, as your children who do have the mediator that Job so longed for, I come before you now boldly, believing that you would want to reveal yourself in truth. You would want us to have a truer picture of who you are, a true picture of who you are. And that if you would bless us with that picture, you would think it a good thing then to lavish upon us that comfort and that peace that surpasses understanding, surpasses pain, surpasses suffering, the kind of joy and peace that we would yearn for over and above a pain-free or a suffering-free life. So, Father, now we just want to submit ourselves to your will and your way. We recognise we can't force it. We can't read enough Bible to make it happen. We can't fast enough to make it happen. We just come before you humbly, believing. That is all we can do. Believing and accepting that you would think it a good thing to forge a tighter, more unified relationship with us. Amen. Okay. Don't worry about tables and chairs. I'll fix them up tomorrow. You guys can get home and get to bed. This week, we're going to be reading Psalms. Like I said, getting through 150 Psalms in 1 week probably defeats the purpose of reading the Psalms. Pick a couple that you like, meditate on it, ruminate on it, read it a few times, and we'll have a good chat about it again next week.